Disclaimer: this video contains discussions of real criminal cases and sensitive subject matter. It is created for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. On a Sunday morning, when the choir lifted voices toward heaven, a drainpipe beneath the church carried a slow, dark secret toward the street. In the sunlight, a single thread of reddish brown tinted the runoff like a blush of rust. Inside, those who believed in grace clasped their hands and closed their eyes. Beneath them, in the oldest part of the foundation, where the original stones sweated in summer heat, the truth waited, heavy, quiet, and sealed into concrete by the man everyone called Pastor. It started with the sound of dripping water. At first, the janitor thought it was nothing more than a leaking pipe, just another maintenance issue in a century-old church, but as he knelt to check the basement drain, something in the air shifted. A metallic tang crept up his nose, sharp, unmistakable, and when his flashlight beam crossed the concrete floor, he saw it, a faint brown stain trailing toward a newly sealed patch of cement. That moment would shatter the illusion of safety that had hung over the congregation for years. Because in a place built for worship and forgiveness, someone had buried their sin beneath the altar. The small town of Rivington had always found comfort in its routine. Sunday services, bake sales, weddings in spring, and funerals in fall. And at the center of it all was Pastor Mark Albright, the man everyone trusted without question. He wasn't just a preacher, he was the moral compass of the town. His voice carried warmth, his presence calmed storms. To many, he was the reason they believed in second chances, but behind that soft voice and kind eyes was a darkness that no sermon could wash away. When Leah Whitcomb, a 25-year-old nursing assistant, vanished in early December, the town turned to Pastor Mark for guidance. Her disappearance shook the community. Leah was the kind of girl everyone knew, quiet, dependable, and deeply faithful. She attended every prayer meeting, volunteered for the food drives, and sat in the second pew every Sunday with her worn-out Bible. The pastor led prayers for her safe return, organized search parties, and comforted her family. His words were perfect, his compassion convincing, but no one knew that the man leading the prayers might be praying for himself. The police combed the woods, checked the rivers, and interviewed anyone who'd seen Leah that night. The last confirmed sighting was on December 12th at 5:34 p.m., when she was captured on a convenience store camera, buying a small bag of soup and crackers. She looked tired but calm, bundled up in a gray coat. After that, nothing. Her car was found 2 days later near the church, doors locked, keys missing. Detective Mara Ellison, a quiet but relentless investigator, noticed something strange when reviewing nearby security footage. Leah had been seen walking toward the church that evening, and though the church had cameras installed, there was a gap, an entire 30-minute window missing from the basement camera feed. When she asked Pastor Mark about it, he smiled gently, explaining that the old system often malfunctioned during storms. Technology has its flaws, he said. He wasn't lying about that. But it wasn't technology that failed that night. It was faith. As the investigation deepened, little details began to form a chilling pattern. A volunteer mentioned how Pastor Mark had been spending more time in the basement lately, claiming he was repairing old plumbing. Another said she'd noticed a strong smell of bleach drifting up from the lower hall, and yet no one dared to question him, because how could the man who baptized their children and married their sons and daughters ever be capable of harm? Detective Ellison wasn't from Rivington. She hadn't grown up hearing his sermons or seeing him bless the harvests. She saw what the townspeople couldn't, the small cracks in his composure, the tension in his eyes when she mentioned Leah's name. And when she asked for access to the church basement, Pastor Mark refused. For days, Snow fell over Rivington, softening the streets and burying evidence beneath layers of white silence. The search for Lee slowed, and the town's grief settled into resignation. Sunday services resumed, hymns echoed through the sanctuary, and Pastor Mark stood at the pulpit as if nothing had changed, but something inside him had begun to unravel. His sermons grew shorter, his smile faded. His prayers lingered too long on the themes of forgiveness, sin, and cleansing. The congregation thought he was just heartbroken over Lee's disappearance. In truth, he was preaching to himself, begging heaven for mercy while the evidence of his guilt sat beneath his feet. Then came the janitor's discovery. The smell, the stain, the patch of fresh concrete that didn't quite match the rest of the floor. He reported it to the church board, who hesitated, then finally called the police. Within hours, Detective Ellison was back with a search warrant. The door to the basement storage room had a brand new padlock, the kind you'd buy at a hardware store. It was polished, unweathered. When they cut it open, the smell of bleach flooded the hallway. At the center of the floor, a rectangular section of concrete gleamed slightly lighter than the rest. Someone had sealed it recently. When forensic teams drilled into it, they found a layer that didn't belong. Plastic fabric, then something that made the entire room fall silent. Inside the concrete was a contractor bag. Inside the bag was Lee. The discovery spread through Rivington like wildfire. The congregation that once adored their pastor gathered outside the church, some crying, some shouting, all betrayed. Inside, Pastor Mark sat quietly in his office, his Bible open, his green ink notes laid across the desk. When police entered, he didn't resist. He simply whispered, "I tried to make it right. But there is no right way to bury the truth. There is only silence, and eventually discovery. It's hard to describe the silence that follows a revelation like that. The town of Rivington didn't just lose a young woman. They lost their faith in the man who had promised to protect it. The church that once echoed with hymns now stood as a hollow monument to deception. And in the center of it all, the basement, the very place where children once practiced Christmas plays, had become a crime scene sealed with yellow tape. Detective Mara Ellison stood in that cold space long after the forensics team had left. The smell of bleach clung to the walls. A single metal cross, once nailed above the storage shelves, lay face down on the floor, its edges rusted. There was something haunting about the idea that a pastor, a man of supposed mercy, had turned this sacred place into a tomb. She didn't speak. She simply watched as the coroner's van pulled away into the falling snow. In the days that followed, the investigation tore through every layer of Pastor Mark's carefully curated life. His computer revealed late night searches about concrete curing times, bleach DNA removal, and how long blood smell lasts in drains. His phone records showed dozens of calls and messages to Lee in the weeks before she vanished, most of them late at night. And then there were the notes. In his office, investigators found a series of journals written in green ink, his private reflections, which he often quoted in sermon. But one section, buried deep in the middle of a notebook labeled Counseling Reflections, stood out. It wasn't scripture, it wasn't wisdom, it was a confession disguised as metaphor. Lines like, "Temptation wears the face of innocence. God tests us with attachments we should not hold. When sin takes root beneath holy ground, one must bury it deep." Every page seemed to whisper what the congregation never imagined, that the sin he spoke of from the pulpit was his own. Lee's family refused to believe it at first. Her mother, Leah Whitcomb, was one of the church's longest-serving volunteers. She had scrubbed those very basement floors during renovations 5 years earlier, never knowing that one day her daughter's body would lie beneath them. She remembered Lee mentioning private spiritual counseling sessions with Pastor Mark, saying they helped her cope after a breakup. But then, months later, Lee grew distant. She stopped attending prayer circles. She avoided the pastor's gaze during service. Something had shifted, and now, in hindsight, it was obvious. Pastor Mark had blurred the line between guidance and obsession, and when Lee threatened to end their secret meetings, he panicked. The forensic report confirmed what no one wanted to hear. Lee had died from blunt force trauma to the head. There were no defensive wounds, just one devastating blow. Experts concluded it was not premeditated murder, but a violent reaction during an argument. Yet the aftermath, the bleach, the concrete, the padlock, told another story, one of control, manipulation, and a desperate attempt to preserve an image. He hadn't just hidden her body, he had tried to erase her existence. When confronted with the evidence, Pastor Mark remained eerily calm. He didn't deny being with Lee that night. He said she confided something painful, and that they argued. She slipped, he claimed. Panic followed, but when asked why he never called for help, why he poured concrete instead of compassion, his only reply was, "God wouldn't forgive me if they found out." Those words sent chills through every person who heard them. Because they revealed the truth. It wasn't guilt that consumed him, it was pride. The fear of losing his reputation meant more to him than the value of a human life. Meanwhile, Detective Ellison worked tirelessly to piece together Lee's final hours. She retraced her walk from the convenience store, matched tire treads from Pastor Mark's truck, and reconstructed the timeline using the church's outdated security system. The footage revealed something devastatingly simple. Lee arrived at 5:38 p.m. Pastor Mark entered the basement at 6:19 p.m. At 7:04 p.m., he exited carrying a large trash bag and toolbox. He drove to a hardware store minutes later, purchasing concrete mix, gloves, and cleaner. That 30-minute gap between her entry and his descent would define the rest of his life. As the news broke, Rivington became a town divided. Half refused to believe it, clinging to the image of the man who baptized their babies and led their prayers. The other half couldn't look at the church without seeing a grave. The cross on the steeple felt like an accusation. The sanctuary felt cold. Former members began sharing stories that, in hindsight, felt off. Private counseling sessions behind locked doors, compliments that lingered too long, subtle pressure disguised as mentorship. It wasn't just one tragedy, it was the slow exposure of a man who had built his entire existence on control and secrecy. At the trial, prosecutors painted a chilling picture of how faith can be twisted into a weapon. They argued that Pastor Mark's authority gave him access, his charm gave him cover, and his fear of shame drove him to destroy the one person who could expose him. The defense tried to spin it as an accident, an emotional lapse, a tragic mistake made in panic. But no jury could ignore the bleach, the tools, the receipts, or the concrete floor that spoke louder than any sermon ever could. When the verdict came, guilty of second-degree murder and evidence tampering, the courtroom was silent. Pastor Mark showed no tears, no remorse, only the blank stare of a man finally stripped of the image he'd worshipped more than God himself. In the end, the church closed for renovation. The basement was torn apart, the concrete slab removed entirely. And in its place, the new congregation built something simple, a glass-walled prayer room with sunlight streaming in from every side. No secrets, no shadows, just light. Lee's mother visits every Sunday morning before service begins. She sits quietly in the garden, next to a plaque engraved with her daughter's name. Leah Whitcomb loved, remembered, freed. The church still stands, the hymns still rise, but the town no longer confuses holiness with appearance. Because in Rivington they've learned that evil doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears a collar. Snow still fell on Rivington when the prison gates clanged shut behind Pastor Mark Albright. Inside, the man who once wore tailored suits and gold cufflinks now stood in a plain gray uniform, his Bible reduced to a small paperback copy provided by the chaplain. The news cameras had long moved on, but for the people of Rivington, the wounds were still raw. For months they had asked themselves the same question over and over. How could a man who spoke of God every Sunday bury such evil under his house? And for Detective Mara Ellison, the answer was both simple and unbearable, because monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they stand in the pulpit. The investigation didn't end with the conviction. Mara continued digging through Pastor Mark's past, searching for patterns, for other possible victims who had trusted him. What she found was not a trail of bodies, but something more insidious, a trail of broken people, women who had once turned to him for guidance and left the church quietly, never to return. There were rumors of private meetings that lasted hours, of spiritual healing sessions. Behind locked doors, some parishioners remembered overhearing crying from his office at odd hours, but they dismissed it, thinking he was comforting someone. In reality, Pastor Mark had perfected his manipulation under the guise of compassion. He used Scripture like a tool, twisting verses about obedience and forgiveness to maintain control over the vulnerable, and Lee, pure-hearted and emotionally fragile after a breakup, had been the one who finally saw through him. Her decision to confront him, to end whatever was happening between them, had signed her death warrant. As Mara reconstructed that final night, the story became tragically clear. Lee had arrived at the church carrying a paper bag of soup, her usual comfort food. She wasn't expecting danger, she wanted closure, but when she told Mark she planned to tell the church board about his behavior, something inside him snapped. A lifetime of image, power, and secrecy, all threatened in one sentence. In the panic that followed, he struck her, once, hard enough to end her life instantly, and then the same man who preached forgiveness spent the next several hours cleaning, dragging, and finally burying what he had done beneath the concrete floor of his own church. The holy ground became his hiding place. He thought sealing the concrete would seal the truth forever, but the truth has a way of breathing through cracks. Back in Rivington, the congregation struggled to heal. Attendance dropped, donations disappeared, some left the church entirely, unable to reconcile faith with betrayal, but a small group of parishioners refused to let the darkness have the final word. They reopened the community food pantry, held candlelight vigils for Lee, and began what they called the basement ministry, a symbolic effort to bring everything hidden into the light. Every Friday they gathered in the rebuilt basement, now bright, open, with glass windows where walls used to be, and prayed for Lee, for survivors of abuse, and even, painfully, for Pastor Mark. Because forgiveness, they said, wasn't about excusing evil. It was about refusing to be destroyed by it. Meanwhile, Pastor Mark lived out his sentence in near isolation. Inmates had little tolerance for men who hid behind faith. He spent his days in the prison chapel, cleaning benches, pretending to read the same pages over and over. But there were no sermons left to preach, no congregation to manipulate, only silence, and the memory of the girl he could never pray away. God said he spent hours staring at the concrete floor of his cell, as though he expected it to open up and swallow him whole. In one rare letter he sent to the court, never released to the public, he wrote, "I built a kingdom on lies and called it a ministry. The only thing buried deeper than her body was my conscience. Detective Mara Ellison didn't believe in divine justice. But when she returned to Rivington months later, she visited the new church garden, rebuilt on the same ground where Lee had been found. It was quiet, filled with wildflowers planted by the community. A small fountain stood at the center, its water shimmering in the sun. She thought about the irony of it all, how one man's sin had tried to bury the truth, but in doing so had created a movement of honesty. Lee's story had become a symbol across the state, shared in workshops for abuse survivors, in sermons about accountability, and even in law enforcement training on recognizing grooming and emotional manipulation. Her death had exposed not just a man, but a pattern, a dangerous myth that titles and trust are the same thing. That spring, on what would have been Lee's 26th birthday, her mother stood before the congregation and said something that stayed with Mara forever. He hid her in darkness, but every time we speak her name, we bring her back into the light. The crowd bowed their heads, some cried, some whispered her name under their breath, because in Rivington no one said Pastor Mark anymore. They said Lee, and in that quiet town, surrounded by fields and memories, the church bells still rang every Sunday morning, not to celebrate perfection, but to remind everyone that truth, once uncovered, can never be buried again. The months following Pastor Mark Albright's conviction brought a strange kind of stillness to Rivington. The once bustling town that gathered joyfully every Sunday morning now seemed quieter, heavier, as though every hymn carried the echo of guilt. The church stood empty for weeks after the verdict. Dust gathered on pews that once held the faithful, and sunlight fell through the stained glass windows, painting colors across the empty altar where Mark had once preached about redemption. But to the people of Rivington, redemption had become a complicated word. It wasn't something they could take for granted anymore. It was something they had to rebuild. Detective Mara Ellison was officially finished with the case, but she couldn't leave it behind. She stayed in touch with Lee's mother, Leah Whitcomb, who was slowly finding purpose again. Elaine had started visiting other churches, talking about Lee's story, warning communities about misplaced trust. Her voice trembled sometimes, but it never broke. One afternoon, she invited Mara to see something she'd been working on since the sentencing. When Mara arrived at the old church grounds, she found construction equipment parked beside the sanctuary. The concrete floor that once concealed Lee's body had been completely removed. In its place stood a new structure, a simple, circular garden enclosed by glass walls. Elaine explained softly, "This will be called Lee's Light. It's for anyone who's ever been silenced, for anyone who trusted the wrong person." The garden wasn't just symbolic, it was personal. Each flower represented a story, a life once hidden in pain. In the center, beneath a small marble plaque, was a verse Lee had once written in her journal. "Faith isn't about who you follow, it's about what truth you refuse to bury." Across town, the remnants of Mark's former congregation struggled to make sense of their faith without him. Many felt betrayed not only by the man, but by themselves, by the fact that they had never noticed the darkness growing behind his smile. One deacon confessed to Mara that he remembered moments when things felt off, a touch that lingered, a door that locked, a request that seemed unnecessary. But in a small town, confrontation felt impossible. After all, who questions the pastor? That silence, those small decisions to ignore the signs, were what haunted them most. The new leadership of the church made a vow. Every counseling session would now take place in open, visible rooms. Every volunteer would undergo background checks, and every member would be encouraged to speak, even if it meant challenging authority. They learned that faith without accountability isn't faith, it's blindness. Inside prison walls, Pastor Mark's life had become one of monotony and reflection. There were no sermons, no adoring congregation, no forgiving applause. Just a gray cot, a cold cell, and a conscience that refused to sleep. He wrote letters, hundreds of them, to churches, journalists, and even to Elaine. Most went unanswered. In one of his final letters to the court, which would later be released after his death, he wrote, "I built a life around the illusion of holiness. When the illusion cracked, I filled it with concrete, but nothing buried stays buried forever. The ground remembers." In those last words, even Mara could sense a rare moment of clarity. But clarity, she thought, doesn't undo damage. It only names it. A year after Lee's discovery, the church reopened, not as First Evangel Fellowship, but simply as the Sanctuary of Light. There were no portraits of pastors on the walls, no grand plaques or gilded crosses. The new pastor, a humble woman named Reverend Grace Allen, began each service with a statement that became their motto: "This place will never hide another secret. Not in the walls, not in the floors, and not in the hearts of those who worship here." Attendance was small at first, but slowly people returned, not out of habit, but out of healing. Survivors from neighboring towns began attending services. People who had been hurt by spiritual abuse found comfort there. And every year on December 12th, the day Lee disappeared, the town held a candlelight vigil around her garden. No sermons were preached, no music was played, just silence, the kind of silence that feels like respect, not fear. Detective Ellison attended those vigils in the back row. She never spoke publicly about her role in the case, but people always noticed her there, standing in the cold, watching the candles flicker in the wind. For her, Lee's case had changed everything. It reminded her that monsters aren't born in alleys. They're often shaped in trust, protected by reputation, and hidden by silence. She kept a photo of Lee in her office smiling, holding a bouquet of daisies, her eyes bright with life. Whenever Mara faced a new case that felt impossible, she looked at that photo and remembered, truth doesn't rest until it's found, and sometimes finding it means tearing up the very foundation you thought was safe. By the second anniversary of Lee's death, Rivington had slowly transformed. The town was no longer defined by what was buried, but by what it chose to rebuild. The church bells rang again, not to honor a pastor, but to honor a victim whose story had forced a community to change. Elaine once said to a reporter, he hid her beneath the floor because he wanted to control how people remembered her. But now, her name is on every flower, every light, every whispered prayer. He buried her body, but we dug up her truth, and that truth became Rivington's redemption. A reminder that evil can wear a smile, holiness can hide hypocrisy, and faith, real faith, begins only when we stop worshiping the people who lead us and start listening to the truth they try to silence. It was a gray morning when the town of Rivington gathered once again in the rebuilt church. The sanctuary looked different now, simpler, quieter, but somehow more honest. The heavy wooden doors had been replaced with glass panels, the old pulpit was gone, and sunlight poured freely into the open space. There was no longer a place for shadows to hide. In the very spot where Pastor Mark once stood to preach stood a new symbol, a single unadorned candle. It burned every Sunday as a reminder truth can't be buried forever. Detective Mara Ellison stood near the back, hands clasped, watching the people fill the seats. Some faces were new, others were familiar, older now, still carrying the faint pain of betrayal, but also something stronger, peace. It had been 3 years since Leah Whitcomb's body was found in the basement, and though the scars of that discovery would never fade, the town had finally found its voice again. The case had changed Mara's career and her life. In law enforcement circles, it became known as the Rivington case, a textbook example of power, manipulation, and moral disguise. She had testified at conferences, warning officers and psychologists that evil doesn't always announce itself. It whispers, it comforts, it prays beside you. She remembered Lee's mother once saying, "The most dangerous people are the ones we don't think to fear." Those words stayed with her long after the cameras stopped rolling. But what struck Mara most wasn't just the horror of the crime. It was how the community responded. They didn't tear down the church, they transformed it. They didn't silence Lee's name, they built an entire ministry around it. In a way, Rivington had done what justice couldn't. They turned grief into prevention. Inside the church, Reverend Grace Allen began her sermon with a pause, something Pastor Mark never did. She didn't shout or demand attention. She spoke softly, like someone who understood that people don't need to be dazzled to be healed. "This sanctuary," she said, "is not built on perfection. It's built on truth, on pain, forgiveness, and memory, because faith isn't supposed to hide what's broken. It's supposed to help us face it." The congregation bowed their heads, and for a long moment the room filled with silence, not heavy, not sad, but reverent. That silence used to mean fear. Now it meant reflection. After the service, Mara walked through Lee's light garden, the memorial Leah Whitcomb had created. The flowers were in bloom, lavender, daisies, and white lilies. A gentle breeze moved through the glass walls, rustling the petals like whispers. She traced her fingers across the marble plaque engraved with Lee's favorite words. "Faith isn't about who you follow. It's about what truth you refuse to bury." For a moment Mara closed her eyes and listened. The birds outside, the hum of the wind, the faint echoes of footsteps in the distance. Life had returned to this place. She thought about how Lee's final moments had been stolen, but her voice hadn't been silenced. Every investigation workshop, every survivor who shared their story, every young woman who now spoke up against manipulation, that was Lee's legacy. Far from Rivington, behind concrete walls and iron bars, Pastor Mark Albright's life had come to a quiet end. Prison records listed the cause as natural causes, but no one in town spoke of him anymore. His name was erased from church plaques, his sermons deleted from the website, his books boxed away and destroyed. When the warden called Lee's mother to ask if she wanted to receive his Bible, she declined. "Let him keep it," she said softly. "Maybe he needs it more than we do." Even in death, Mark remained what he had always been, a man trapped by his own secrets. His faith, once a weapon, had become his punishment. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, the town gathered again for Lee's annual vigil. No one gave speeches. There were no tears this time. Instead, each person lit a candle and placed it around the garden's edge. A child, too young to remember the tragedy, asked his mother, "Why do we light these candles?" His mother smiled gently and said, "Because sometimes even the darkest places need light." Mara stood nearby, her face illuminated by the candle's glow. She watched the lights reflect off the glass walls of the church, creating a soft halo around Lee's name, and in that moment she understood what true justice meant. Not punishment, but remembrance. Not vengeance, but change. As night settled over Rivington, the garden glowed, a circle of light in the darkness, visible from nearly every street. The people who once lived in fear now stood unafraid, their voices stronger, their faith more real. The story of the pastor who hid a body in the church basement had become more than a tragedy. It was a lesson written in stone, soil, and candlelight, a reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. Because the ground remembers, and so do the people who refuse to forget. In the end, The story of Rivington wasn't about a pastor, a crime, or even the tragedy itself. It was about what happens when a community chooses truth over comfort. Because the moment Lee disappeared, the town stood at a crossroads. They could bury what they'd seen, or they could face it, and they chose to face it. They tore open concrete floors, shattered illusions, and rebuilt something honest in the ruins of deception. The church that once hid a secret beneath its foundation now stands as a symbol of transparency, a place where light touches every corner and silence is no longer mistaken for peace. Lee's name lives on in the flowers, in the scholarship fund that helps young women study nursing in her memory, and in every survivor who finally finds the courage to speak. She became the voice that never stopped echoing through Rivington, the voice that forced truth to rise even from the coldest ground. And as for Pastor Mark Albright, his story is a grim warning that power, when unchecked, can rot even in sacred places. His downfall was not sudden. It was the slow decay of a man who worshipped reputation more than redemption. But evil, no matter how holy it pretends to be, can't hide forever, because concrete cracks, secrets breathe, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to the light, to Leah Whitcomb, whose life was stolen, but whose truth restored faith in an entire town. May your memory remain a beacon for those still searching for courage. To her mother, Elaine, and every family who has lost someone to hidden evil, may your voices never again be silenced, and may justice always walk beside your grief. And to everyone listening, remember this: trust should never be blind, and faith should never be silent. When something feels wrong, speak. When someone disappears, keep searching, because sometimes the most sacred places can hide the darkest sins, and it takes courage, not prayer, to uncover them.